Okay, dear friends, great honor, great privilege to have Dr. Neithen Greenfield today as our speaker. And I'm happy to welcome everybody, all members of our virtual academic community concerned with sociology in general and historical sociology of conflicts arising within social systems at different levels of human society, local, regional, nation states, and up to global one. Dr. Greenfield has a PhD from McGill University, top Canadian university, and we've been fortunate to have Neithen as our lecturer at the Department of Sociology at Kyiv Polytechnic Institute, Igor Sikorsky Kyiv Polytechnic Institute. He's a volunteer slash lecturer, and together we've been collaborating closely, delivering lectures to our students, mostly graduate students, with a very specific focus and emphasis with our PhD students, because our PhD programs, it's within the parameters of general sociology. It's kind of official name, educational program is sociology, but its uniqueness, its unique trait or feature is the focus on historical microsociology of modernity, modernities, modernizations, and conflicts that arise in the context of the struggle for modernization, struggles over the formulation and the implementation of the politics of modernization, the role of the state in these processes. How can we build a developmental state? What kind of state qualifies as the developmental one? So this is in the nutshell what we've been doing, what we've been researching, and what we are interested in as scholars, academics, students of sociology, and students in sociology. And Neithen's interest, Neithen's background is just a dovetail lock with our research interest. Neithen has penned a huge number of books of kind of military histories, and his PhD, although it was in literary theory, but basically it was a sociology of literature, dealing with reflection of racial inequalities in 19th century African-American literature. And today's lecture is on anti-intellectualism, anti-intellectual strand in American society, in American culture, and Donald J. Trump as its pinnacle, as far as I understand. Neithen, without further ado, I'd like to invite you to the floor. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, I'll put this to slideshow from the beginning. There we go. And I control it that way. Good. Okay, so yeah, we're discussing today anti-intellectualism and Donald J. Trump, a man who reputedly has never read a book since he graduated high school. And okay, of course, we want to start with some definitions, which I can't now. I can't read them all, so I'm going to take us out of that because well, what if I turn you guys into grid? No, that doesn't help me a whole lot. Okay, I'm going to take us out of that so I can read my slides. Okay, anti-intellectualism in American life was written in 1963 by Richard Hofstadter, one of America's great historians of the middle part of the century. So 1963 is, last time if my math is correct, it's well, it's a little younger than I am. It's about 62 years, it's a great book, and is sort of the text on understanding anti-intellectualism in the United States, its history, and its how it impacts American politics. These are a couple of definitions from Hofstadter. Anti-intellectuals anti-intellectualism is characterized as, quote, a resentment of the life of the mind, that is to say, what we guys do here, and those who are considered to represent it, and a disposition to constantly minimize the value of that life. And I emphasize those bolds are mine, and I emphasize, as they are in the second quote, and I emphasize that because it's important to understand that anti-intellectuals in American life, or anti-intellectuals in the United States, don't just not want to read books. They don't just, don't want to be bothered with ideas. They don't want to get vaccinated, and we'll deal with that later in the lecture. They, in a positive way, from the point of view of action, do not value the life that I, Pavlo, and because you are grad students, I'm going to assume you also value. And they will do much to disrupt that life. Secondly, intellectuals are considered pretentious, conceited, snobbish, and likely very immoral, dangerous, and subversive. The plain sense of the common man is altogether adequate to substitute for, if not actually much superior to, formal knowledge and expertise. In other words, my opinion is, because I think something, let us say, about a vaccine, I don't know, I have not done any research. I hate the phrase which is used in North America, do your own research. When my doctor says, asks me if I want to do research on a vaccine, I say, no, that's your job. I'll tell you where to put the commas. You tell me which vaccine to take. They then laugh. And I'm very thankful that I said that. But so very likely immoral, dangerous, subversive. Again, I was the one who emphasized those words. So intellectuals are seen as foreign to America, effete, snobbish. In the 19th century, they was viewed very much as upper class aristocrats from Britain, because most of the intellectuals came from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, because those were where the big schools were. Immoral, dangerous, subversive, starting in the following the First World War, seen as, communists, socialists, or at the very least sympathetic to them. The idea that knowledge is subversive, and you can see this now playing out in the United States, especially the attacks on universities. And we'll work our way through this. In terms of questions, I think I'd like to get through the lecture, but if you have a question in terms of not understanding something I said, let me know. You can then just come on, say you have a question. If it's a interpretive or, let's go further question, please save that. Okay, so anti-intellectualism in American life, Hofstadter also says, no, I got that. I did that one. Okay, some stats. 54% of Americans read at or below a 6th grade level. That is to say, they have a reading level of an 11 or 12-year-old. that's 130 million Americans, approximately. 21% of Americans are illiterate. So you have 54% who read at a level of a 12-year-old, and 21% of whom cannot read at all. 46% have not read a book in the past 12 months. 20 million Americans out of 340 read newspapers or either in paper or online. So 20 out of 340 million. Do the math. So, it is not an impressive. You can look at the PISA numbers. That's PISA, International Education Testing. PISA. You can, if you wanted to Google that, and you can compare countries. The United States is at the bottom of the industrialized world. The reading level of Trump's speeches are at a 4th grade, which is one of the reasons why when people with our education, we hear them, they sound like word salad. That's also part of his notion of the weave. he calls it, the weave, that he structures his speeches to wander all over the place, to include references to Al Capone. Al Capone, the mobster, who this is his what it's called his rap sheet. The various times he was arrested between 1919 and 1930. He was finally gotten on tax evasion, of all things. But so he talks about, he wove in Al Capone, and he talked about the late, great Hannibal Lecter. Does anybody know who Hannibal Lecter is? I might every now and then ask some questions. Pavlo, you're not allowed to answer. Does anybody know who who Hannibal Lecter was?
Yes, of course. It's a famous film about Hannibal Lecter, The Lamp of Silence. Yes, about yes, it's one the famous film in the Oscar Julianne Moore.
Yes,
not
yes.
Julianne Moore, but okay.
Yeah,
Anthony Hopkins. Yes.
Yes, Anthony Hopkins. Yes, great performance.
Yeah.
Anthony Hopkins plays Hannibal Lecter, an extraordinarily intelligent man who happens to like to eat people. The movie is called The Silence of the Lambs. You are correct. Yeah, and so the reason why he's wearing this is that he tends to bite the police. So he wove into most of his speeches the mobster Al Capone and the late, great Hannibal Lecter, as though Hannibal Lecter was a real person. And in fact, Anthony Hopkins spoke out and said, "Would you please stop using my character?" Now, sounds like madness. This is, a presidential candidate, three times running, to actually be building into his speeches these kind of references. And what he did by doing this was create this sort of alternative reality where the fact that Al Capone was a mobster, the mafia, and was, famously, as I said, arrested and convicted for tax evasion, and Lecter, who was A, didn't exist, and B, if he did, would have been a murderer, into the speeches creates this alternate reality where nothing is the way it is in the real world. And you can only do that when you have sundered the reality, severed the reality of intellect and this kind of created space. And this is what was key to his popularity as a campaigner. Okay, let's look at some numbers again. So this is the share of Democratic voters with no college experience. So these are the total number of voters, high school or less. It has declined, but in 2019, 32% of total Americans had high school or less, or some college. So that's 55%. If you look at lean Republican voters, it was 70%. So what you're looking at here is a base of ill-educated people. If you remember, we had the numbers up here on the 54% read at 6th grade or below. So and here we're looking at people with just a high school. Now, the reading level to get out of high school is around 10%, but it's actually not followed. 10th grade, but it's actually not followed terribly closely. That is, it's not enforced. Richard Hinton, who's a professor at George Washington University, wrote a book in 2021 called "It Can Happen Here: White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the United States." Now, "It Can Happen Here" is a play on a book, "It Can't Happen Here," which was written in the 30s about how an attempt to have a fascist coup in the United States, Sinclair Lewis is the author, fails. But that was after, of course, the rise of fascism and in Italy and Nazism in Germany. But it almost succeeds in the book. But But so he's playing on that title, and he's saying, in fact, in 2021, and he was even more so today. I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago. He believes it can happen here. So he's a cultural anthropologist. And cultural anthropologists study cultures, including present-day cultures, much like sociologists do. And the aim of the exercise is to try to get inside the mindset of the culture you're studying. So to do that, he went to many MAGA rallies and many Trump speeches, and he came back, from this sort of, alternative world with an interesting report. And the report was that it's a mistake to view Trump as stupid and demented, or as having dementia, as often is portrayed on websites or X postings by the other 98%, Occupy 98, or the other 98%, or Republicans against Trump. They take images like Trump, not being able to hold a water bottle properly. They show him, making. I saw one the other day where he stumbled a bit going into Air Force One. He is 78. And so he says it's a mistake to view that. And it's interesting, if you go look at Trump's speeches in the rallies, they often sound like word salad, as I said before. Trying to find a line in them is impossible. But when Trump is interviewed one-on-one, as he was yesterday by Laura Ingraham, or the day before yesterday by Laura Ingraham, Fox News, he's completely coherent. I'm completely disagree with what he's saying. Like when he says Canada was meant to be the 51st state, Canada doesn't work as a country. I completely disagree. He doesn't know what he's talking about in terms of the Canadian economy and the Canadian psycho-political reality. But the statements are clear. They have an internal logic. His logic is, if the country, and he keeps saying that Canada is subsidized by the states to $200 million a year. What he means by that actually is that there was a trade surplus. Americans buy $200 million more per year from Canada than Canada buys from the United States. If you remove oil, it's actually $200 million in the other direction. He's calling a trade surplus a subsidy. It is not. He's wrong, but it's not dementia wrong. It's political lying wrong. But once you accept that that's what he means, you can then make sense of what he's saying. Now, it is still said at a 6th grade level. But that is, he's speaking to the American public, Fox News viewers. He's not going to start talking about the way we would speak in a sociology class. He's also a charismatic speaker. Now, I find that hard to believe, but I trusted Richard, that when you're at the rallies and he's speaking, he is mesmerizing. He sounds like a friend of the family or family elder. And it's very important to remember in thinking of Trump and anti-intellectualism that, or we jokingly say your nutty uncle who comes for Thanksgiving dinner. He's been on before he became a politician. He was on reality TV for 30 years, doing this what we call a shtick, this act, and so everybody knows it. Who watches reality TV? I did not, but and then the next point is everything is viewed and explained through MAGA. Make America Great Again. All problems, and when he accepted the nomination the first time for the Republican Party, he came out and he said, I alone can fix it. I can fix all your problems. So everything is funneled through this defined world of being against immigration, of being against the DEI, or cultural political correctness, as wanting to put people back in their place. and that includes women, blacks, African Americans, intellectuals back in their place. It means I know more than the generals about, that was about the Afghan war at the beginning. I know more than all the generals. I know more about, pollution. I know more about how to solve the problems in water distribution in the North America. I know more than there has never been a case where Trump has ever been asked a question and said, I don't know the answer to that. I'll get back to you. But people buy into this in the MAGA movement. They see themselves as being part of a mission or a movement. And Richard said to me that at some of the rallies, people go up to the campaign bus and they sign the big pictures on the campaign bus of Trump or whatever candidate it is, sign it with Sharpies as if they're signing the high school yearbook. Any questions on what I'm talking about? Okay. Hannah Arendt, whom I'm sure you all know, wrote voluminously on loneliness and totalitarianism and the path from one to the other. So loneliness, she says, is a precursor to totalitarianism. Totalitarian movements thrive on the experience of loneliness, social isolation, where individuals feel uprooted and disconnected from society. Now, most of Trump's support comes from small-town America. Not all of it. He did win some of the cities. But most of it comes from small-town America or from the suburbs, where people, especially in small towns, they may not feel isolated from their friends, although if you look at the data of, let's say, the pre-COVID, post-COVID, and the 1960s, even in small-town America, the sense of loneliness and social isolation has grown tremendously. There's a great book, I think it's Richard Florida, but I'm not sure on that, called Bowling Alone. Bowling as in the game. Bowling Alone in America. And it charts in a sociological manner the decline of bowling leagues and things like that, which brought people together. So even in small-town America, people feel socially isolated and uprooted, disconnected from the society. They may not feel disconnected from their neighbors particularly, but they feel disconnected from the path society has taken. And here is where we get into liberalization, in the sense that if you have a 1950s or even a middle 1960s view of what the world is like, I'm stereotyping a little, but stereotypes, can be useful. The idea was the mom stayed home with the 2.2 kids. As a white male, you were not in competition for a job with blacks or Hispanics because they were either in the South, where their jobs were awful, or if they came north, they were still discriminated against. So you lived in this lily white universe. Now you don't. And that, from my point of view, that is a good thing, but that now you don't. And you also feel, if you're from the industrial Midwest, that you're isolated because your jobs have gone elsewhere. And, Trump does, I have a question. Okay. On the grievance culture, winners and losers, the Pew Research. Yes, Pew does a lot of this work, and it's really good work. So yes, thank you very much. It's lost my train of thought. Yes, the industrialized Midwest. Now, it's not, the big steel mills that have closed, the big industrial plants that have closed, were not closed by the Chinese. They were closed by American companies that sent the work overseas to China or India or Bangladesh, because it was cheaper to make whatever and then ship it back to the United States. and sell it at the same price, and the companies made more money. So when Trump says the Chinese took your jobs, they didn't. It was American capitalists that sent them overseas. But that's a tough thing to accept in small town America, which worships American capitalism. So you lose your job, or you will always have the possibility of losing your job to offshoring of industrial development. So you feel uprooted. Then she goes on to talk about loss of reality coherence. Here she builds on Gustave Le Bon's 1895 book, The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind, which is one of the first works of sociology. Social anthropology could also be called. And if you haven't read it, it is well worth the read. Has anybody read it? Raise your hand. No? Okay, it's a really very important book. Loneliness can lead to...
Neithen,
Yes.
If I may intervene, I think it was in late 80s or early 90s, and I produced an article on Gustave Le Bon's another book, which was titled The Psychology of Socialism. A great book.
Yes.
Kind of interestingly enough, it was published in Russian Empire before the revolution, and one of the print runs was printed by the print house belonging to a prison. So kind of interesting, like some prison in St. Petersburg. But there were numerous editions, a great book, and that article is still available in Ukrainian academic journal called Philosophical and Sociological Thought. It's now defunct, or it was rather divided into philosophical journal and sociological journal. Yeah, but extremely interesting author, of course, very controversial, extremely racist, misogynic, right?
Yeah, but the study on the crowd is when he talks about how the crowd, I think it's the third or fourth chapter, he talks about the crowd becoming a single mind. And that's what she's getting at here. So loneliness can lead to the disintegration of common sense. Well, and Le Bon writes about that the crowd can turn into a mob at a moment's notice, where the line between true and false is blurred, and people become susceptible to propaganda and the fabricated realities offered by totalitarian regimes. And in Le Bon's case, it's not even a totalitarian regime, it's the crowd itself can turn on an individual or a group. But the key thing I wanted here was disintegration of common sense. True and false become blurred. If it's not so much with totalitarianism, and this was true in Soviet Russia, it's actually true in Putin's Russia, that it's not so much they want you to believe X, Y, and Z. They don't want you to believe anything. And so the line, if you don't believe anything, then the line between true and false vanishes. And then you become open to totalitarian ideologies. They offer a sense of belonging, coherence to people who feel lost. This is the same thing that we talk about with incels, that is to say, involuntary celibates in the United States, young men who, for whatever reason, cannot function in the dating milieu, in the social ecology of a bar or high school, and cannot, basically we say they can't get a date. They have no relationships with women, and by the age of 23, 24, 25, they become rabidly anti-woman, misogynist, and often killers. So what the incel movement does is it gives them a sense of belonging and coherence. Of course, if you Google incels on the net, first of all, you'll never get out of it. Secondly, you're going to end up in some pretty dark places. But it'll give you a sense of belonging, especially if you're a young man, 19 years old, with obviously hormonally charged, and unable to have a relationship with a woman. or a man, actually, it can be either way. But you end up, so you fall into this category of involuntary celibate, and this gives you an explanation. So the same thing happens in the case of, using that just as a quick model, in terms of this larger thing. So Trump gives a model, or MAGA gives a model of understanding, of coherence, of new logic. We have the new enemies. We all have the same enemies. They're immigrants. They're intellectuals. They're universities. They're black people. They're African American. They're Aboriginal Americans. They're Hispanic Americans. Of course, they're not like us. And us is small town white America in its mythology. Organized loneliness. People abandon the ability to think for themselves and become isolated in their own thought. So they're not thinking critically, nor are they being trained to. So you have the education systems in the American South and in Appalachia, which are designed not to teach critical thinking, although that's all they yatter on about. Destruction of the public realm. Destroy the space between people that allows them to relate to another in meaningful ways, leading to a wilderness where neither experience nor thinking is possible. So the totalitarian movement does that, and Trump does that by constantly throwing at us this act. If you think of, I think we were up to 108 executive orders. He's been in office for 55 days or 56 days. So every day he sits at the Resolute desk, and there's this mise en scène of this guy coming in, with a paper, sign this, and it's executive order to do this or that. First of all, they have no legal standing. Second of all, many of them duplicate each other. So it's part of this playing of a kingly role, which he loves to do, of course. Okay. Ronald Reagan's legacy, because Ronald Reagan shares has a role in this. So the Ronald Reagan ended the fairness doctrine in broadcasting. The fairness doctrine was that because the airwaves, this was back when we had only TV and radio, the airwaves were scarce. You couldn't have that many stations in a small area. And New York had the most, and that was 11 TV stations. That was before cable. He ended the fairness doctrine, which required every TV station to demonstrate in their licensing application that on public issues, they showed fairness. They had this view and that view. He ended that, which led to the creation of Rush Limbaugh's radio station and Fox News, where they never have to present to their viewers or listeners an alternative viewpoint. So this, of course, leads to what we call the echo chamber, that you're constantly being besieged in your media world by the same message. Then there's Ronald Reagan's first budget, which drastically cut social services, of course. And in the debate about it, Reagan went on TV, and this is what he said. I couldn't find the exact quote, but I remember watching it. So it was something like this. Write to your congressman and senator. Tell them, I don't want an essay. I just want to know, are you for them or against them? And for them or against them, meaning are you for Reagan or against Reagan? In the answer so you don't want your congressman, a woman or senator to send you back a letter saying it's a complicated question whether we up tariffs, lower tariffs, or whatever it is. We have to take this into account. We have to take that into account. It's not an easy decision. No, I just want to know, are you thumbs up or thumbs down, like some Roman emperor? So this is important because this is a legacy of Reagan into the Republican Party that really came into its own under the leadership of congressional Republicans Newt Gingrich. And it's whether or not it's a no holds barred, yes or no, support for the Republican, whatever the Republican has to say. Now, the use of the word essay is what I want to key on here in a historical sense. The history of the essay is from the French essayer, to try or to attempt, essayer, to try or to attempt. Though the form did exist before, the first person to describe his writings as an essay was Michel de Montaigne, 1533-1592. In his terms, an essay was a thinking through, an attempt to understand the place of intellectual work, and also where the intellect intersected with the individual's experience, in the case of Montaigne, who also brought it in his own biography, as well as the usual structures of intellectual discourse. So it's an attempt to understand, it's a trying out, it's conditional, and it's a deconstruction of an idea as opposed to the simple yes or no. As I said, the form did exist before Montaigne used the term, although not exactly as he uses the term. Prior to Montaigne, we could look at the writings of Martin Luther or John Calvin as essays, although they also are pamphlets or political/religious tracts, which is to say they support a political or religious idea. I assume you all know who Martin Luther and John Calvin were. Okay. Both Luther and Calvin's writings are important. And you might wonder why I've jumped to Luther and Calvin when we're talking about the United States. I'll get back there. Are important because while they established the tenets of Protestantism, that is to say, a religion-based sola scriptura, they never used the word inerrancy to describe the Bible. Now, sola scriptura means only scripture, and nothing about. So the missal of the Roman Catholic Church, the writings of Augustine might be interesting. Augustine, especially because of how he analyzes the Bible, but only the Bible, literal word of the Bible. And this creates the distinction between inerrancy and infallibility, which is the Catholic view. I'm much more familiar with the Roman Catholic world, so I will be speaking about that in the next few minutes. I believe it more or less describes the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the other Eastern, what's called the Eastern Rites, RITES, from the Roman Catholic point of view. So inerrancy means that the word of the Bible is inerrant. It cannot be wrong. If the Bible says that the sun stopped in the sky, as it does in Book of Genesis, then it stopped in the sky. If the Bible says Noah spent 3 days inside a whale, then Noah spent 72 hours inside a whale. Inerrancy, it cannot contain error. The Catholic view is that it's infallible. It is not wrong, but requires interpretation. So there you get the entire structure of Catholic interpretation of the Bible. The difference is important because it allowed the Catholics, even though they were obviously close to totalitarian or at times totalitarian in Western Europe, there always was room for some movement in terms of belief. So the Catholics view the story of Jonah and the whale as a metaphor, as something to be interpreted. Now, of course, they have very strict guidelines in how they interpret, but they do their guidelines do allow for the idea of metaphorical usage. In the Calvinist Lutheran tradition, that doesn't exist. It's inerrant. That's important for the United States, as you see in a minute. Inerrancy, which is central to American evangelicals, which is the largest part of Trump's base, is, as I said, the belief that the Bible cannot have an error because of the word, it's the word of God. But Luther and Calvin, although they came close, they never said the literal word of God matters. It only matters in faith and doctrine, not in other issues, such as the parables, or as I said, not so much, as the kids say today. So the parables of the sower in the New Testament, of the prodigal son in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, the story of David and Goliath, they have enough room in themselves, amongst the Lutherans, the Calvinists, to have some, idea of, we have to interpret this, but it's literal in terms of the faith and doctrine. Now, where you draw that line, of course, is a historical dilemma. Now, American evangelicalism stems from mostly from Calvin. Pilgrim settlers of Massachusetts, which led to the famed Salem witch trials of 1692. Other waves, the Scotch-Irish, Protestants who settled in what is now Kentucky, Tennessee, and the southern states, their religious belief was that the Bible was inerrant. They were even more Calvinist than Calvin. Some years ago, and this is true, a Texas state legislature, sorry, that should be tour, not legislature, was interviewed about his belief that Texas's laws should conform to the Bible. The interpreter pointed out that the Bible was translated from Aramaic and Greek and Hebrew to various languages. The legislator replied, "No, if English was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me." He truly believed that Jesus spoke English. So the American evangelical view is a highly anti-intellectual view. First of all, it ignores the historical fact of translation and what that means. Secondly, it is literal in the sense that it believes the actual words are what God said, but ignoring that translation issue at the same time. It also is anti-intellectual in the sense that it doesn't allow for the fact that the last book of the Bible is 2,000 years old, slightly before the creation of the internet. I'm being facetious, of course. But the point is, it can't possibly hold within a literal reading. It cannot hold application to the world of vaccines. Okay. The First Great Awakening, which was a religious movement that swept across the United States, what is the United States now, and England in the 1730s and 40s. It emphasized a personal connection to God through faith and the Word of God in the Bible. Now, it was sort of a return to the very early days of Luther and Calvin, who were now 200 years in the past, since we're in the 1730s. And the personal connection to the God is very important because it meant that no one can tell you what to believe anymore about what the Bible says. So every man was his or her own, well, man in this case, because women didn't count at the period in the theology. Every man was his own pope, so to speak. he could decide what to believe and what not. Now, that sounds like a recipe for anarchy. But in fact, because of how society works, people glommed together and created the churches. Now, that's why amongst the Protestants, you have the Methodists, Episcopalians, Anabaptists, Lutherans, Calvinists. We can go on and on. One of the important people in the First Great Awakening was Jonathan Edwards, an American, 1703-58. And his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. So this is quite Calvinist. I'm going to read a bit of it to you. The God that holds you over a pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you, that is to say, the God hates you, and is dreadfully provoked by you. His wrath towards you burns like a fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire, that is to say, thrown into the fire. He is purer of eyes to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times so abominable in his eyes as the 7 most hateful venomous serpent is to our eyes. I've never figured out if that's 10,000 times 7 or just 10,000. You have offered him infinity more than ever a stubborn rebel did his prince, and yet 'tis nothing but his hand that holds you from falling into the fire every moment. Happy thought, isn't it? What Edwards is getting at here is the idea that your faith alone and God's giving grace or not, and by the way, faith won't get you grace. This is not the doctrine of works of the Catholic Church. This is Luther and Calvin, where works don't count. It's only God's grace that keeps the filament of the thread, the spider, from burning over the fire and you falling into hell. Now, this is also highly anti-intellectual, as much as Edwards was himself probably the most intellectual man in the United States at the time, except Benjamin Franklin, well-read, etc., and an extraordinary writer. What it is it's anti-intellectual because it removes the mind, the human actor, from anything having to do with the ultimate ends of humanity. And this personal relationship to God, and through a literal word of the Bible, means that there can be no interpretation about anything, really. And then, if you think of the world of the intellect, the intellectual, and the intellectualism, it is interpretation. It's nuanced. American evangelicalism, too. The point of preaching was no longer to explain difficulties, because there were preachers all over the place. Rather, it was to engage emotions and heighten fears. The United States was awash with itinerant, which means to say walking around, preachers at this time. They would come to a town, everybody would come out to the field, and they would preach. It was entertainment to some degree. At the same time, it democratizes in the sense that you could shop around for a preacher whom you connected with. So if you didn't like this preacher, you could go over to that preacher. So there's this odd tension within the American evangelical world that way. And that's why in small town America, Pablo has lived in the United States, so he's seen this, you can find dozens of churches. The first Anabaptist church of, Sudbury, Ontario, the second evangelical church of Sudbury, Ontario, the first Presbyterian, the second Presbyterian. You have dozens of churches in these small towns. Which leads us to evangelicalism and modernism. 19th century is one thing to have those beliefs, or at least the early 19th century and late 18th. But you move on, you get Darwin versus the literal word of God. So you get the what's called the Scopes monkey trial in July of 1925, where John Scopes, who was a high school teacher, he knew he was breaking the law in Tennessee. He taught about evolution. The charge was brought against him in order to force a trial. That was the aim of the exercise. William Jennings Bryan, former Secretary of State, 3 or 4-time candidate for the presidency by the Democrats, defended Tennessee's law. William Clarence Darrow, the great attorney, defended Scopes, and he actually won. Scopes lost the case and was fined $5. But Clarence Darrow destroyed William Jennings Bryan on the stand because he put Jennings Bryan was one of America's great evangelical proponents. He put him on the stand and started quizzing him on the Bible, on the story of Jonah. And Jennings said, if it says he was in the whale for 3 days, he was in the whale for 3 days. Well, of course, this was also broadcast across the United States. It was the first across the cross-country broadcast. You sound like an idiot. And but to the evangelicals, Bryan was their defender against modernism, against Darwinism, because Darwinism to them took away God created man in the second day God created man. It doesn't say anything about Big Bang. Of course, modern day evangelicals actually start being a bit more metaphorical about that, and they say, well, the act of creation could be the Big Bang. Rejection of vaccines, masks, and COVID. Numerous studies linked anti-intellectualism to opposition to vaccine and to the opposition to vaccines or masks, or even the urge to mask up, because why would I take expertise from you? You only have, Dr. Fauci, 40 years experience and 3 PhDs. Women's rights and abortion. Women's rights, because the Bible's letter of Paul, he says women should be subservient to men. Abortion, because it's the Bible does not allow abortion. That, by the way, happens not to be true. Abortion is allowed in the Old Testament before quickening, which means to say before a woman feels movement. But the evangelicals who in 1966, they came within 5 votes on the Evangelical Council of the United States, some 10,000 people, within 5 votes of accepting abortion as a legitimate practice, because the Bible, in fact, could authorize it. Contraception, because of one line in the Bible, the quote-unquote sin of onanism in the Old Testament. It's always interesting with the evangelicals, who are, of course, Protestants, who then say they can read the Old Testament, which, of course, is supposedly superseded by the New Testament, more correctly than the Jews can. Well, the sin of onanism is, in fact, considered a sin, but there's a whole bunch of parameters around what happened when Onan spilled his seed on the ground. One of the lines nearby is, don't wear anything made of linen and wool. It's a death sentence. However, the evangelicals, to give them their due, have a complicated view on slavery. And this was important, of course, in the history of the United States. And it becomes important in how evangelicals view African Americans. On one hand, there's a sin of Ham. The literal word of Bible, the curse of Ham, Noah's son, Genesis 9:24-25, quote, so Noah awoke from his wine, Noah, if you might recall, got drunk, and knew what his younger son, Ham, had done unto him. That is to say, Ham had come into the 3 sons have to come into the cave. 2 of them make sure they walk in backwards, they cover their eyes. Ham doesn't. Then he said, cursed be Canaan, which was the the nickname for Ham. A servant of servants he shall be to his brethren. That is the only biblical line that justifies slavery. It's a very specific event. I say justifies in quotation mark because, of course, I don't believe it does. But that line is what evangelicals pointed to throughout the slavery period in the United States as the justification for slavery. And Canaan for them would be or Ham would be those who ended up leaving the land of Canaan and populating Africa and becoming blacks. If this sounds silly, it is. Or if it sounds convoluted, it is. But there's also evangelicals had a view, more liberals at least, of God's grace for all. Hence, many Americans who are African American are evangelicals, including Martin Luther King Jr. and his father, Martin Luther King. The most important example of the complicated views of slavery, or at least the best example, is Amazing Grace. John Newton was a sea captain. He was a captain of a slave ship. That is to say, picking up kidnapping African Americans and bringing them to various points in the New World, including the United States, to be sold. On one particular voyage across the sea with a complete load of slaves, he realized what he was doing was wrong. And he turned around, returned to Africa, and freed those who survived what was called the Middle Passage. Usually about between 5 and 10% died in the holds of the slave ships. And he wrote this hymn, Amazing Grace, which I will not sing to you, but it starts with, Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Now, blind, of course, was his blind faith, but it also is his blindness to what he was doing as a slave captain. And he goes through the conversion, but now I see. I once was lost, but now am found. So this is another part of evangelicalism, to give it its due. Level of education ranked in Republican states. Now let's see if this works. So far, no. What do I do to get this to work? Is it control? No. Okay, let's try this. We might be successful. We are. You, of course, cannot see it. So I have to... Can you see it? Can you see the West Virginia?
No, we cannot see it.
Okay, because that's because you're still seeing. So I should stop share, go back to Zoom. Go back to Zoom, go to share, and go there and share. Can you see now? West Virginia?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so this is Newsweek. States by education ranking. Less than high school, 4.3%. Ninth grade, 8%. High school equivalent, 40%. It's the least educated state in the union. And then Mississippi. I'm not going to go through all the numbers. I just want you to see. West Virginia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Kentucky. Nevada's an odd one here. That's usually Democratic state. Alabama, Oklahoma, Texas, Tennessee, Indiana, New Mexico, South Carolina. So what you're seeing there is the fact that it's those states, the ones that are most reliably Republican, are the least educated states. In 2019, Trump lost the Iowa caucuses and did not do well in New Hampshire. He was saved by a resounding victory in the second important primary, which was in South Carolina. In an interview after he won, remember the list I showed you, he said, "I love the poorly educated." Why? Lack of reasoning skills, lack of numeracy skills. And that's the whole subsidy bit about Canada, which I discussed earlier, so I won't take our time on it again. Lack of historical knowledge. In 2019, a 2019 survey showed that only 40% could pass basic American history test. I have some of the answers. I don't have to go to that. 72% of respondents were either incorrectly or identified or were unsure of which states were part of the original 13. I've seen answers as bizarre as Texas and Florida, which at the time was Spanish. I've seen answers, people answer this question, with complete, oddities. Only 24% could correctly identify one thing Benjamin Franklin was famous for, with 37% believed he invented the light bulb, which confused him with, just dropped out of my head, Thomas Edison. Benjamin Franklin invented the lightning rod, but not the light bulb. He was a printer. One of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, ambassador to France. I can go on and on and on. He was not the inventor of the light bulb. Only 24% could answer correctly why the colonists fought the British. So a quarter of Americans don't know why the American Revolution occurred, but they'll march with the tricorner hats on July 4th. And make believe they're fighting the British. 12% incorrectly thought General Dwight Eisenhower led the troops in the Civil War. That was General Ulysses S. Grant. 6% thought he was a Vietnam War veteran. So 18%, close to a fifth of Americans did not know that Dwight Eisenhower was the commanding general of the Americans in the European theater in the Second World War, not to mention a president. While most knew the cause of the Cold War, 2% said climate change caused the Cold War. While running for the president for Senate, President Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, said professors are the enemy. The movie Animal House, 1980s movie, which was really awful, had this great line, though. Emil Farber founded Farber University, and the statement here is, knowledge is good. Or another way of putting the end, so we have time for some questions, is, that's what I do. I read books and I know things. So, we can go to questions. I'll take off the stop share. So, any questions?
Nathan, let me thank you for a fantastic lecture. And cannot check myself, and I do have a question. And we have a great friend of our department. She's our British colleague. She's a reader at our partner university, which is Oxford Brookes University in Oxford, although it's not the Oxford University of Oxford, but in the city of Oxford. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, she's an expert on Ukrainian politics. So she often uses this expression, being deliberately provocative. So being deliberately provocative, I can't help but ask you, looks like your argument falls under the rubric of famous or infamous Hillary Clinton.
Deplorables.
Saying, a bunch of deplorables.
A basket. We discovered in that line that deplorables come in basket, not bunches.
Basket. Basket.
Basket.
Yeah.
Basket. To some degree, yes. And I know that, we're not, I'm, I could be accused of being an elite snob, but what the anti-intellectuals believe is deplorable. And they believe it for deplorable reasons. Are they themselves deplorable people? No. In fact, if you have to be anywhere in the world probably and have a flat tire, small town America is probably the best place to, or Canada for that matter, but for small town America is probably one of the best places to need help individually, even if you happen to be Black or Hispanic.
Mhm.
But the beliefs that they have been, taught by the school system, the underfunded school systems, that their pastors, now the mega pastors of these, evangelical churches that are worth 20 million and put the Vatican to shame, what they teach is deplorable. And I think it needs to be said that, and their contempt for expertise is, leads us to nobody liked wearing masks during COVID. I wasn't, I didn't, wake up, on the, whatever day it was in March after the COVID and say, gee, I'm really happy. I want to get a needle today in my arm. None of us, this wasn't something that none of us who, thought about it, thought with glee, but it was necessary to do for reasons that we understood. And they're not that hard. And, the willful, so I don't think a presidential candidate should put it that way, but I'm not a presidential candidate. So I think I can say that their beliefs are deplorable. Any other questions?
But what about cultural conditions shaping lives of these baskets of, or this basket of deplorables, like underfunded schools, Rust Belt, deindustrialization cycle?
Yes.
Lack of jobs, this fentanyl.
Although in many parts of the areas you're talking about, which would be Appalachia, the beliefs were there when they had good jobs in the steel mills before the deindustrialization, because we know that from the Scopes monkey trial. And we know that from the resistance to integration in the 1950s, 60s. So before that. So although you're correct to point to it, okay, I've been asked a question. Cynthia has put a question. Let me get it. Oh, I think you're absolutely right. She's asked the question, from a sociological perspective, might you discuss the Trump phenomenon as more of a purposeful process than a judgmental process? I assume you mean me judging. What about trends in stratification, the use of disinformation, changes in the media landscape? Oh, you're absolutely right. And I tried to touch on that with Rushlam, with the fairness doctrine on the changes in the media landscape. That's the key moment in it, because having done away with the fairness doctrine, you could then stratify the media, and everybody gets their own media. You get MSNBC, you get Fox News, you get One American News, but all of that would not have been possible had the fairness doctrine stayed in place. Even on the internet, it would have been the governing issue, because the internet is governed by some of the same rules because of cable technology, etc. So you're absolutely right about the stratification. Now we tend to Trump's people, supporters, they do run the gamut from the rich to the poor. There are, of course, highly educated people who in the cabinet, like Lutnick, who have signed on with Trump, but many of them have signed on for mercenary reasons. I find it very hard to believe that Howard Lutnick actually it wants to go to, his goal in life is to ban abortion in the United States. It simply doesn't make any sense. What he wants is lower taxes. So he's in the libertarian part of Trump's support. I was concentrating on the anti-intellectualism. So Lutnick isn't part of that. Neither, for that matter, is do I think that Musk is really part of that. They're on a different, but there aren't enough of them to vote him in. The support comes from small town, lower class, lower middle class, white America. And that's the group I was trying to discuss in terms of the anti-intellectualism. The Marjorie Taylor Greens of this world, who thought Fauci should be shot for being a traitor because he told people to wear masks when there was a virus killing 20,000 people a day across the United States in the early days of COVID. Cynthia, did I answer your question? Are there any other questions?
Well, generally
Okay,
speaking,
wait,
I find
Cynthia has said interesting insights, but I wonder where is the exit then? Interesting question. I mean, you're not going to like my answer, I don't think. I suspect the United States has fallen into a somewhat soft form of fascism. I don't hold that much hope for the Constitution surviving in its present form. When the Supreme Court issues, if and when the Supreme Court issues a final ruling on a case, not on stays on injunctions, but a final ruling, let's say on birthright citizenship, and the Supreme Court says birthright citizenship is in the Constitution, end of story, and Trump says, I don't care, we're going to start deporting people, the Constitution then doesn't matter. And as J.D. Vance said, we don't care what the judges say. They don't have an army. So they are willing to use, at least they say they're willing to use the army to ignore the Supreme Court. Okay. Cynthia's asked a secondary question to that. Then I'll get to use Demetrio. Alone or with our new allies' help? The new ally, I assume you mean is Russia? If you speak, I'm unsure. Can you just clarify what you mean by new ally? While Cynthia does that, I'll take Putin, yes. Oh, yes, I think that the United States is following a Putin-esque path. There's no question. I mean, Trump counts him as a friend, as he does with Xi and Kim Jong-un. There's absolutely no question. Did I ever think I'd see the United? I mean, I who grew up in the United States as an American citizen still, with Russia being the evil empire, etc., and every Republican thinking that anyone who said anything nice about Russian music or Russian literature was a communist. To see them all lining up to get into bed with Putin is, it's. The only way to put it is, irony is not the word to describe it. Dimitro, your question.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the lecture. My question is, so why there is a notable difference between the college, how college graduated voters do vote, but it's like not that drastic, like all college-educated vote for Democrats and all uncollege-educated vote for Trump. It's like about 55 to 45 or so, based on the exit polls results. So what do you think seems educated people vote for the MAGA anti-intellectualists like Trump?
Well, you get an interesting thing. If you look at the county by county breakdown, so like, for example, New York, 8 million people, it has a very large number of ill-educated people. But they tend to vote Democratic because New York is a Democratic city. Ditto for Boston, ditto for Philadelphia, ditto for San Francisco. So, if unionized, poorly educated people tend to be Democrats, it's probably a 55-45 split nationwide. Because of in the South, the unionized people are not, the ill-educated are not unionized because most of the states don't allow unions. And then you get those who support Trump who are wealthy. So those who want lower taxes, or because the price of eggs were too high. Look at the price of eggs today. So you get those who vote on quote unquote pocketbook issues, and then you have the question of a black woman running in the United States. And though I held out hope for her, I thought she ran as good a campaign as you can, having 100 days to prepare it. When you look back at it, the idea of the United States voting in a black woman was just too much for two reasons. One, because she was black, and one, because she was a woman. The Obama elections were flukes in American history. Had George Bush not been, and Obama, had Romney not campaigned so poorly, he probably would have beaten Obama. And had Bush not been so tarnished by the Afghan war, the failure of the invasion of Iraq and the 2008 crash, then, and had let's say that Romney had been the nominee and not McCain in 2008, Romney would have won. So I too thought the Obama elections were the turning of the page. They're not. They're a fluke in the history of the country, and the country has reeled to undo those elections. And insofar as even turning its back on democracy to make sure that a black woman could not be president. I know I'm putting it in very stark terms, and the betrayal of Ukraine, and I use that word purposely, and I've spoken about this on Canadian radio. I was brought on a radio station in Saskatchewan to discuss what happened in the Oval Office. And first of all, I firmly believe it was a put-up job. In other words, a trap that was set purposely. And that the absolute Trump's acceptance of everything Putin wants was open, and the American people voted for it. Not by a huge amount. He talks about a huge mandate. It was 1.5% victory. And he talks about winning the 7 battleground states, which he did. But nationwide, it was 1.5%. But important on that is when you look up where the Democrats ran up their numbers, California, New York, Massachusetts, take out the states that you run up the numbers, California, Massachusetts, Texas, Florida for the Republicans, you still see a huge support for everything Trump is doing he said he would do, including siding with Putin over Ukraine, and for that matter, siding with autocrats around the world. I'm probably depressing the hell out of you guys. Any other question? Oh, there must be one other question. We have time for one more. No one? Have I put everybody to sleep?
No, it's been comprehensive, thought-provoking, and sometimes disturbing in a sense that kind of makes us think really hard in the sociological terms on issues you've been talking about and issues you raised. Kind of make us or stimulates us to exercise our sociological imagination, which is good in a sense that we've got sociological imagination, and we have a subject matter to reflect upon. Although this subject matter is extremely controversial and could be dangerous.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This has been a pleasure. We have another one in April, and I think it's on W.E.B. Du Bois.
Exactly.
Yeah, and on that one, I'll send a short reading list because Du Bois was the first black sociologist in the United States, well, first black sociologist, and it's on double consciousness in American racial structures and Ukraine. And I'll leave it right there as a teaser.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you. It's been really great.
thank you. Take care.
You too.